My parents threw me out at 13. Garbage bags on the porch, no explanation, just gone. 15 years later, they showed up at my uncle's while reading with a lawyer, designer suits, and smiles so confident you'd think they'd already spent the money. But when that attorney read Clause 7, my mother's face went white. My father actually stood up. And their lawyer? He walked out mid-reading. You need to hear what was in that will. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. Let me tell you about the exact moment I realized my parents didn't just not love me. They genuinely wished I didn't exist. I'm sitting here in my Seattle apartment right now, rain streaking down the windows, and I can still feel the weight of those garbage bags. Black, heavy duty, the kind you use for yard waste, not for your daughter's entire life. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand how I got there. Portland, Oregon. Southeast neighborhood. Modest house, 2-car garage, the kind of place where everyone waves at their neighbors and pretends their family isn't falling apart behind closed doors. I was 13 years old, and I was the spare child. You know what that is, right? The one they kept around because it would look bad if they didn't. The one who exists in the margins of family photos. The one whose birthday cake says "Happy Birthday" with no name because it was marked down at the grocery store, a canceled order from someone else's party. Yeah, that was literally my 13th birthday cake. 3 months earlier, my sister Tiffany got a 3-tier bakery cake from the fancy place on Hawthorne. 15 guests, a karaoke machine rental, the whole production. My mother beamed the entire time. For me? For people around a kitchen table with a generic leftover cake. No guests, no decorations, just the 4 of us and the sound of my mother checking her phone every 5 minutes like she had somewhere better to be. And you know what's insane? I thought that was normal. I genuinely believed I deserved less because that's what they'd been programming into me since I could form memories. My sister Tiffany was the golden child. Literally golden. Blonde hair, blue eyes, my mother's face copied and pasted onto a younger body. Everyone said it. Tiffany looks just like you did at her age, Sandra. And my mother would light up like someone had just told her she'd won the lottery. Me. I looked like my late grandmother, Dad's mother. Brown hair, brown eyes, quiet. My mother never said it was bad. She just never said anything about me at all. That's the thing about emotional neglect. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's the absence of everything. It's realizing at 12 years old that your sister has a college savings account with 8 years of deposits, thousands of dollars, and when you ask your mother why you don't have one, she looks at you like you just asked why the sky is blue. Tiffany needs money for college, she said, stirring her coffee like we were discussing the weather. You'll figure something out. You're good at adapting. Good at adapting. That's code for you don't matter enough to plan for. And I adapted. I learned to be small. I learned to not ask for things. I learned that love in my family wasn't equally distributed, it was rationed, and I wasn't on the list. But here's where the story really starts. April 2010. I applied for the Oregon STEM Summer Academy at Oregon State University. 6 weeks, fully residential, for students who showed exceptional promise in science and mathematics. Out of over 2,000 applicants across the entire state, they selected 50 students. 50. The scholarship covered everything. Tuition, room, board, materials. Total value, $4,200. I didn't tell anyone I applied. I'd learned not to get my hopes up out loud in that house. When the acceptance letter arrived on May 15th, I held it in my hands and cried in my bedroom for 20 minutes. For exactly one afternoon, I felt like I mattered, like I was worth something, like maybe I wasn't the spare child after all. Then Tiffany found out about a performing arts camp in California. 3 weeks, no scholarship, price tag $3,800. And suddenly my full ride, merit-based, I earned this myself opportunity became a problem. That night at dinner, my mother announced the solution she'd worked out in her head. Not a discussion, not a question, An announcement. Diana, you'll decline that science thing. We can't afford to send both of you to summer programs, and Tiffany's camp will help her college applications. She said it the way you'd discuss meal planning, like she was choosing between chicken and fish, not crushing her daughter's dreams, not stealing an opportunity I'd earned. I stared at my plate. My father said nothing. He never did. He was a man of few words, and most of those words were, "Yes, Sandra." But something in me broke that night. Or maybe something finally woke up. The words came out before I could stop them. No. The whole table went silent. Even the refrigerator seemed to stop humming. My mother's voice dropped to that dangerous register I'd heard her use on customers at the grocery store who tried to use expired coupons. "Excuse me. This scholarship isn't your money to redirect," I said. My voice was shaking but clear. "I earned this. It's mine." I can still see the look on her face, like I'd transformed into a stranger right before her eyes, like I'd betrayed her by daring to exist as a separate person with separate worth. "If you can't sacrifice for this family," she said slowly, each word dropping like a stone, "then you're not part of this family." At 13, I thought she was just angry. I thought she'd cool off. I thought we'd talk about it later and find some compromise. I didn't realize she meant it literally. 3 days later, I came home from the public library at 6 p.m. I'd been studying there because the house always felt too small, too suffocating, too full of Tiffany's laughter and my mother's selective attention. When I turned onto our street, I saw them immediately. 2 black garbage bags sitting on the front porch. My mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked resolved, like someone who'd just finished an unpleasant chore, like someone who'd taken out the trash. "I called Harold," she said. "No greeting, no explanation, just facts. He'll be here to pick you up. From now on, you're his problem." I stood there on the sidewalk, trying to process what was happening. My entire life, 13 years of existence, packed into 2 garbage bags. Not suitcases, not boxes, garbage bags. Behind my mother in the hallway, I could see my father. He didn't look at me. He didn't say anything. He just stood there like a piece of furniture, completely still, completely silent, completely useless. I looked up at the second-floor window. Tiffany was watching from behind the curtain. When our eyes met, she didn't wave. She didn't mouth, "I'm sorry." She just stepped back into the shadows of her room. She didn't come down. Not once. I waited on that porch from 6 p.m. until 10 p.m. For hours. My mother went back inside after the first 5 minutes. The porch light never came on. I sat there in the growing darkness, knees pulled to my chest, watching cars pass by, wondering what I'd done that was so terrible I deserved this. Uncle Harold lived in Seattle, 3 hours away. He drove through the night to get to me. When his gray Honda finally pulled into the driveway at 10 p.m., I was still sitting on those garbage bags, shivering in the May evening chill, trying to understand how the people who were supposed to love me most in the world could do this. He got out of the car without saying anything at first. Just walked up the driveway, looked at me, really looked at me, the way my parents never had, and wrapped me in a hug so tight I couldn't breathe. "From now on," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "you have a home." We loaded the garbage bags into his trunk. My entire childhood fit in there with room to spare. As we drove north through the darkness toward Seattle, I stared out the window and watched my life disappear behind me. I didn't know that before Uncle Harold left that house, my mother had signed a document. I didn't know what it said. I didn't know what it meant. I was just a scared 13-year-old kid wondering what I'd done wrong, wondering why I wasn't enough, wondering if maybe they were right about me all along. It would take 15 years for that document to resurface. And when it did, when that attorney opened that envelope in that conference room with my parents sitting there in their designer outfits and confident smiles, thinking they were about to cash in on the man who raised me, everything they'd done, every choice they'd made, every cruelty they'd inflicted would come back to destroy them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Right now, you need to understand something crucial. My parents didn't just abandon me that night. They didn't just throw me away like garbage. What they did was so much worse. And in part 2, I'm going to tell you exactly what that document said, why my mother's face went chalk white at the will reading, and how Uncle Harold planned his revenge from beyond the grave 15 years in advance. Because here's the thing about people who betray children. They always think they'll get away with it. They always think the child will stay small and scared and powerless forever. My parents bet their entire future on that assumption. They bet wrong. Stay with me. Seattle felt like another planet. Uncle Harold's house in the Ballard neighborhood wasn't large, but after 13 years of occupying the smallest possible space in my parents' home, it felt enormous. For the first time in my life, I had a room that was entirely mine. Not shared, not conditional, mine. But here's what really changed everything. I had someone who believed in me. Uncle Harold had built Myers Property Holdings from scratch. Started with a single small office building he'd purchased after working double shifts for 6 years. By 2010, he owned 8 properties across the Seattle metro area. He never married, never had children. When I arrived on his doorstep with nothing but 2 garbage bags, he didn't just take me in. He invested in me. And I'm not talking about money, though that came later. I'm talking about something my parents never gave me, the belief that I was worth the investment. Over the next 4 years, I poured everything I had into school. Every bit of rage, every ounce of hurt, every moment of I'll show them went into my grades. I graduated from Ballard High in 2014 as class valedictorian, president of the math club, 4.0 unweighted GPA. The University of Washington offered me admission with a partial scholarship to their Foster School of Business. By 2018, I had my bachelor's degree in finance, graduating summa cum laude with a 3.94 GPA. Uncle Harold gave me internship opportunities at Myers Property Holdings starting my sophomore year. I learned the business from the ground up: data entry, lease analysis, tenant relations, property assessments, the boring stuff that nobody wants to do, but everybody needs to understand. In 2019, after 18 months at a Big Four accounting firm, I earned my CPA certification. 1 year later, Uncle Harold offered me a position as controller. By 2021, I was CFO. At 26 years old, I managed a portfolio of 12 commercial properties with a combined value of $23.7 million. Let that sink in. The girl they threw away like garbage was managing a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio. The daughter they decided wasn't worth a college savings account had become a certified public accountant running an entire company's finances. The child they said had figured it out so thoroughly that she was making more money at 26 than both of them combined had made in their entire lives. On my 26th birthday, Uncle Harold sent me an email. I still have it saved. The subject line read, "To my daughter." Not niece, daughter. The message was simple, but it broke me in the best way. You don't need to prove anything to the people who abandoned you, but you do need to prove to yourself that you're worthy. You have. Happy birthday, Diana. I cried reading that, because he was right. Every achievement, every grade, every promotion. Part of me was still trying to prove to Sandra and Richard Myers that they'd made a mistake, that I was worth keeping, that I mattered. But here's the thing about my biological family during those 15 years. They reached out exactly 3 times. 3 times in 15 years. And every single time it was about money. The first was in 2012. I was 15, still adjusting to my new life, still processing the trauma of being thrown away. My mother called Uncle Harold's phone. Not mine. His. She didn't ask how I was doing in school. Didn't ask if I was okay. Didn't ask if I missed them or if I needed anything. She asked for $5,000. My father had lost his job at the auto shop. Times were hard. Surely Harold could help his own brother. Uncle Harold declined. He told me about the call afterward, his jaw tight with anger he was trying to contain for my sake. "They haven't asked about you once," he said. "Not how you're doing in school, not if you're okay, not if you're happy. They just want money." That's when I realized something crucial. To my parents, I had never been a person. I'd been a resource. And when I stopped being a useful resource, when I dared to claim something for myself, I became disposable. The second contact came in 2016. I was 19, in my second year at University of Washington. Tiffany mailed me a wedding invitation. No personal note. "No, I hope you're well." "No, I'm sorry for what happened." Just a formal printed card with my name and Uncle Harold Seattle address written in calligraphy. I didn't attend. I didn't send a gift. I didn't respond at all. Because here's what I'd learned by then. Silence is the most powerful response you can give to people who expect you to perform emotional labor for them. They expect tears. They expect anger. They expect you to come crawling back, desperate for their approval. They don't expect silence. They don't expect you to build a life so complete, so whole, so utterly independent that they become irrelevant. The third contact was in 2020. I was 23, working as controller at Myers Property Holdings. My mother sent me an email. The first direct contact she'd initiated since throwing me out 10 years earlier. The subject line was checking in, as if we were old friends who'd lost touch, as if she hadn't legally abandoned me. The message mentioned that she'd seen an article in Seattle Business Journal about Myers Property Holdings expanding into the East Side market. She hoped I was doing well. She suggested we should catch up sometime. I read that email 3 times, analyzing every word like it was a contract, which in a way it was. She wasn't checking in. She was checking my net worth. She'd seen the article. She'd done the math. She'd realized the spare child she'd thrown away was now connected to serious money. I deleted the email without responding. Not out of spite. Not out of revenge. Out of complete and total indifference. I had simply built a life that didn't include them, and I saw no reason to change that. But here's what I didn't know. Here's what nobody told me until it was too late, or maybe too perfect. Uncle Harold knew they'd come back eventually. He knew that the moment he died, the moment there was money to be claimed, Sandra and Richard Myers would crawl out of whatever hole they'd been hiding in and demand their share. So he planned for it. In the summer of 2024, Uncle Harold received a diagnosis that changed everything. Congestive heart failure, advanced stage. The doctors gave him 12 to 18 months. He lasted 8. During those final months, he met with his estate attorney multiple times. He updated his will in June 2024, 6 months before he passed. When I asked him about it, he just smiled that knowing smile of his. "Everything's taken care of," he said. "You focus on the business. I've handled the rest." I didn't know what he'd written. I didn't know about the clauses. I trusted him completely. I had no idea he was building a legal nuclear bomb specifically designed to detonate in my parents' faces. Uncle Harold passed away on February 28th, 2025. He went peacefully in his sleep at Swedish Medical Center with me holding his hand. I was 28 years old, and I'd just lost the only parent who'd ever mattered. 1 week later, March 7th, I was in my office at Myers Property Holdings when my phone buzzed with an unknown Portland number. I almost didn't answer. I should have trusted that instinct. "Diana." The voice was immediately recognizable. 15 years hadn't changed my mother's particular way of saying my name, like she was tasting something she wasn't sure she wanted to swallow. "Sandra," I said. Not Mom, just her name. A brief pause. I could almost hear her recalibrating, adjusting her approach. "I heard about Harold," she said, injecting her voice with what I assumed she thought sounded like sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I was thinking I should come up for the memorial service. Pay my respects." "The memorial was 3 days ago," I said flatly. Another pause. Longer this time. "Oh, well, I also heard there's a will reading coming up. Family has a right to attend these things, you know. especially when it involves a brother's estate. There it was, the real reason for the call. Not condolences, not concern. Money. Always money. How did you find out about the will reading? I asked. I have an attorney, Victor Harrington. He made some calls. The name sparked a faint memory. Uncle Harold had mentioned a Victor Harrington once, an attorney he'd consulted years ago and decided not to work with. Red flag number 1. I spoke to Margaret Morrison, Uncle Harold's estate attorney, the next morning. She confirmed my suspicions immediately. Sandra had hired Victor Harrington to file a claim challenging the will. Their grounds? Undue influence. They were alleging that I had manipulated a sick man in his final months to change his estate plan in my favor. They were also demanding to attend the will reading as immediate family members of the deceased. I stared at the photo of Uncle Harold on my desk. In the picture, he was smiling, almost like he'd known this would happen, almost like he'd planned for it. Margaret's office occupied the 47th floor of the Columbia Center, Seattle's tallest building. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, you could see all the way to Mount Rainier on a clear day. March 10th wasn't clear. Rain streaked the glass as Margaret laid out the situation. Victor Harrington filed a formal challenge to the will on behalf of Richard and Sandra Myers, she said, sliding a document across her desk. The claim alleges undue influence. They're arguing that you isolated Harold from his family during his illness and pressured him to change his estate plan. I read through the filing, my stomach tightening with each paragraph. They were demanding 50% of the estate. Their legal theory was that as Harold's only surviving sibling, Richard should be entitled to inherit under intestacy rules or at minimum receive a significant share that reflected the natural bonds of brotherhood. Natural bonds. I actually laughed out loud at that phrase. Richard and Harold hadn't spoken in 8 years before I came to live with Uncle Harold, I said. Did you know that? Margaret nodded. I'm aware. Harold told me the whole history, but that's not what concerns me about this filing. She pulled out another page. They don't need to win this case. If this goes to litigation, the estate could be frozen for 12 to 18 months during discovery and trial. Meanwhile, the properties need management. Tenants need attention. Bills need to be paid. A protracted legal battle could cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees and potentially devalue the entire portfolio. So they're betting I'll pay them off to make them go away, I said. That's the strategy, Margaret agreed. It's not unusual in estate disputes. I looked down at the challenge filing. In the section describing our family history, Sandra had written that I had abandoned my family and exploited Harold's loneliness. The woman who threw me out was claiming I abandoned her. The audacity was almost impressive. Margaret asked the question that would change everything. Do you have any documentation about your circumstances in 2010? Anything that establishes what actually happened when you went to live with Harold? I thought back to that night on the porch. The garbage bags, the 4-hour wait, Uncle Harold arriving in the darkness. I was 13, I said. I didn't exactly keep records. Margaret smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone holding a royal flush. Harold did. And that's when everything clicked into place. That's when I realized Uncle Harold hadn't just saved me 15 years ago. He'd been documenting everything, building a case, creating a paper trail, preparing for the exact moment when my parents would show their true faces. In part 3, I'm going to tell you exactly what that document said. I'm going to tell you about the will reading where my mother's face went white, where my father stood up in shock, where their lawyer literally walked out of the room. Because what Uncle Harold did wasn't just smart. It was surgical. It was devastating. It was absolutely perfect revenge, served ice cold from beyond the grave. Stay with me. This is where it gets good. Margaret reached for her phone and dialed her assistant. She asked for a specific file number from the archives. 20 minutes later, her assistant returned with a yellowed folder. Margaret opened it carefully. scanning the contents with the precision of someone who knew exactly what bomb she was about to detonate. Then, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Diana, did you know about this?" She slid the document across the desk. The header read, "Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights and transfer of guardianship," dated July 15th, 2010. I stared at those words. July 15th, 2010. 3 days after they threw me out. 3 days after I sat on that porch in the dark. The document stated that Richard James Myers and Sandra Ellen Myers, being of sound mind, voluntarily relinquished all parental rights and responsibilities for their minor daughter, Diana Marie Myers, and transferred full legal guardianship to Harold Raymond Myers. At the bottom were 4 signatures: my mother's, my father's, Uncle Harold's, and a notary public from King County, Washington. File number 2010 GH 5847. "They didn't just kick you out," Margaret said quietly. "They legally gave you up. They signed away their parental rights. As far as the law is concerned, Sandra and Richard Myers stopped being your parents the moment they signed this document." My hands were trembling. I'd been 13 years old, sitting on a porch in the dark, and inside that house my mother had been signing papers to erase me from her life. Not just emotionally, legally, officially, permanently. What does this mean for their claim? I asked, though part of me already knew. Margaret's expression shifted into something that could only be described as predatory satisfaction. "It means Richard has no standing to claim inheritance through familial relationship. Legally, he's not your parent. He severed that connection himself in writing with witnesses 15 years ago." She offered me 2 paths forward. Option 1 was negotiation. Reach out to Victor Harrington. Explain that their legal position was weaker than they realized. Offer a settlement of $500,000 to $1 million in exchange for them withdrawing their challenge and signing a waiver of any future claims. It would be faster, cleaner, and avoid any public spectacle. Option 2 was to proceed with the will reading as scheduled. They demanded to attend as family members. We'd let them. Then we'd present the evidence, the guardianship, transfer document, the full history, everything Harold had wanted disclosed in the event of exactly the scenario. "Harold anticipated this, Diana," Margaret said. "He left specific instructions for how to handle it. He wanted the truth on the record." I went home that night and couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room of the house Uncle Harold had left me, staring at the family photos on the mantel. There were pictures of me at every stage: high school graduation, college commencement, the day I got my CPA license, my first day as CFO. In every photo, Uncle Harold was beaming beside me like I'd hung the moon. There were no photos of Richard or Sandra. Not one. I thought about Uncle Harold's words from that email years ago. "You don't owe them anything, but you owe yourself the truth." At 7 the next morning, I called Margaret. "I want the will reading to proceed," I said. "No settlement, no buyout. If they want to be present for this, let them come. But we're not hiding anything." "Are you sure?" Margaret asked. "Once this becomes public," "They chose to make this public when they filed their challenge," I interrupted. "I'm just respecting their choice." The will reading was scheduled for Friday, March 14th, 2025 at 2 p.m. in the Morrison & Associates conference room. 5 days away. The next few days were a blur of preparation. My best friend, Elena Torres, helped me organize the documentation. She was the only person besides Margaret who knew the full story of my childhood. We'd met when she joined Myers Property Holdings as HR director 3 years earlier. 47 emails, Elena said, looking up from her laptop in my office on Wednesday evening. 47 emails from Harold to you over 10 years documenting his relationship with you and his reasons for estranging himself from Richard. The emails painted a clear picture. In 2002, Richard had borrowed $80,000 from Harold with a written promise to repay it within 5 years. 23 years later, Not a single dollar had been returned. That broken promise had fractured their relationship years before I ever entered the picture. My arrival in 2010 had nothing to do with their estrangement. It had already been festering for 8 years. Elena also pulled the financial reports from my 3 years as CFO. Under my leadership, the Myers Property Holdings portfolio had grown from $17.7 million to $23.7 million, a 34% increase in value. Occupancy rates averaged 96%. Tenant satisfaction scores were the highest in the company's history. On Thursday evening, I met with Dr. Lauren Hayes, the therapist I'd been seeing since my early 20s. "Remember why you're doing this," she said. "You're not seeking revenge. You're closing a chapter. There's a difference. What if I feel satisfaction when they realize they've lost?" I asked. Dr. Hayes smiled gently. "That's called justice, Diana. Feeling validated when the truth comes out isn't the same as cruelty. The question is what you do afterward." I drove home that night through Seattle's rain-slicked streets, thinking about her words. I looked in the bathroom mirror before bed and spoke directly to my reflection. She has no power over you anymore. Only you get to decide your story now. Friday was coming, and I was ready. The Morrison & Associates conference room occupied a corner of the 47th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. On a clear day, it would have been breathtaking. On March 14th, 2025, the sky was overcast, the water a steel gray that matched my mood. I arrived 15 minutes early at 1:45 p.m. I wore a navy blue tailored suit. Professional, understated. My hair was pulled back in a simple bun. I'd learned from Uncle Harold that the most powerful people in the room never need to announce themselves. The conference room could seat 20 at the main table with additional chairs arranged along the walls. When I entered, 14 people were already present. Margaret Morrison sat at the head of the table with 2 junior associates. Thomas Graham, the senior auditor from Mitchell and Partners who had handled Uncle Harold's accounts for a decade, occupied a seat near the window. Representatives from 3 charitable organizations filled several chairs: Seattle Children's Hospital, Habitat for Humanity Northwest, and the Olympic National Park Foundation. Uncle Harold had been a significant donor to all 3 for over 20 years. 5 senior staff members from Myers Property Holdings sat together near the door. They'd worked with Uncle Harold for years and had known me since my intern days. Margaret caught my eye and nodded toward a seat at the center of the table, directly across from where she would be reading the will. I took my place, arranging the folder of documents Elena had prepared in front of me. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see the elevator lobby. At 2:03 p.m., the elevator doors opened. My mother stepped out first. Even from across the floor, I could see she'd dressed for the occasion. Black dress, pearl necklace, full makeup. Behind her came my father, looking uncomfortable in a gray suit that didn't quite fit anymore. He'd gained weight in the years since I'd seen him. Then Tiffany in a pastel pink dress, an odd choice for will reading, like she'd gotten confused about what event she was attending. And finally, a man in an expensive suit carrying a Mont Blanc briefcase. Victor Harrington. The show was about to begin. Sandra Myers entered the conference room like she owned it. That was always her way, projecting confidence she hadn't earned, claiming space she hadn't been given. Her pearl necklace caught the overhead lights as she surveyed the room with a practiced expression of dignified grief. Behind her, my father shuffled in, his eyes finding me briefly before darting away. He'd always been good at looking away. Their attorney, Victor Harrington, brought up the rear, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of polished confidence that came from decades of high-stakes litigation. His Mont Blanc briefcase probably cost more than my first month's salary at Mitchell and Partners. Sandra's gaze swept the room until it landed on me. "Ah," she said, her voice carrying in that way she'd perfected. "You're here already." I didn't stand. "Sandra." The single word, her name, not Mom, made her pause mid-stride. Something flickered across her face. Then she recovered with practiced ease. "I was hoping we could speak privately before this starts. Family matters should be handled by family." "The proceedings begin in 2 minutes," I said. "I'm sure whatever you have to say can wait." Margaret Morrison rose from her seat. "Mrs. Myers, Mr. Myers, Ms. Myers, Mr. Harrington. There are seats arranged for attending parties along the wall. The main table is reserved for beneficiaries and estate representatives." Sandra's jaw tightened visibly. She'd expected a seat at the center of things. Instead, she was being directed to the margins. She wasn't even at the table. Sandra didn't take her seat quietly. Instead, she detoured past the representatives from Seattle Children's Hospital, pausing to introduce herself with an expression of practiced sorrow. "I'm Sandra Myers," she said loud enough for most of the room to hear. "Harold's sister-in-law. We were quite close for many years before this unfortunate estrangement." She glanced meaningfully in my direction. The hospital representative, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia Wells, nodded politely but said nothing. Sandra continued undeterred. "It's so tragic how some people come into a family and create division. Harold was such a generous man, so trusting. Perhaps too trusting." I kept my eyes on my folder. I didn't respond. I'd learned long ago that Sandra fed on reactions. Tiffany, settling into a chair against the wall, added her piece. "Uncle Harold used to visit us in Portland all the time when we were kids. I don't understand why she gets to sit up there and we're back here." Victor Harrington was already taking notes, his pen moving across a legal pad, documenting everything, building their case, looking for any reaction he could twist into evidence. I gave him nothing. Sandra took her seat beside Tiffany, but she wasn't finished. As Margaret organized her papers at the head of the table, Sandra's voice cut through the quiet room once more. "A child who's been rejected by her parents usually has a reason. I just wish Harold had seen through her the way we did. A mother always knows." The words hung in the air. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Thomas Graham, the auditor, was staring at Sandra with open disbelief. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in 15 years. She hadn't changed at all. The same certainty, the same need to control the narrative, the same absolute conviction that she was the victim. Margaret cleared her throat. "It's 2:10. We'll begin." Margaret Morrison broke the seal on a large envelope with the careful precision of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times. "This is the last will and testament of Harold Raymond Myers," she began, her voice carrying the formal weight the moment demanded. "Born July 4th, 1953. Deceased February 28th, 2025. This document was executed on June 18th, 2024, and represents the final expression of Mr. Myers's wishes regarding the disposition of his estate." Sandra sat forward slightly, her pearl necklace catching the light. Margaret continued reading the preliminary sections. Article 1 confirmed Harold's identity and residence. Article 2 declared him to be of sound mind. Margaret noted that a psychiatric evaluation had been conducted by Dr. Stephen Park on June 10th, 2024, 8 days before the will was signed. The evaluation confirmed Mr. Myers possessed full testamentary capacity and was under no undue influence at the time of execution. Margaret read. I caught Sandra exchanging a glance with Victor Harrington. They'd been banking on challenging Harold's mental state. This documentation complicated their strategy. Article 3 revoked all prior wills and codicils. Then Margaret turned to Article 4, the inventory of assets. At the time of death, Mr. Myers' estate included the following: 12 commercial properties located throughout King County and Snohomish County with a combined assessed value of $18.2 million. Investment accounts containing diversified equity, holdings valued at approximately $4.1 million. Cash and liquid assets totaling $1.4 million. I heard Tiffany whisper to Sandra, "That's almost $24 million." Sandra nodded, her eyes calculating. Margaret looked up briefly. The will contains 47 pages. I will now proceed to Article 5, which addresses specific bequests and exclusions. She turned the page and adjusted her reading glasses. Article 5, regarding Richard James Myers, brother of the deceased. Sandra actually smiled. She wouldn't be smiling for long. Margaret's voice was steady as she read the opening line. I make no provision in this will for my brother Richard James Myers for the following reasons, which I wish to be read aloud and entered into the record. Sandra's smile flickered. Margaret continued reading Harold's words. First, in March of 2002, Richard borrowed $80,000 from me with a written promise to repay the full amount within 5 years. 23 years have passed. Not $1 has been returned. I have retained the original promissory note as documentation. Richard's face went pale. He hadn't expected this. Second, on July 15th, 2010, Richard and his wife Sandra voluntarily executed a legal document relinquishing all parental rights to their daughter, Diana Marie Myers, transferring full guardianship to me. This document was properly witnessed and notarized. Sandra shot to her feet. What does that have to do with anything? Margaret paused, looked at Sandra over her glasses, and continued reading without acknowledging the outburst. The significance of this document is as follows. By legally terminating their parental relationship with Diana, Richard and Sandra severed any claim they might have had to inherit from me through her. Diana is my legal heir. Richard is not her legal father. Therefore, Richard has no familial relationship with my designated heir and no standing to challenge this while on grounds of family connection. Richard stood now too. This is ridiculous. I'm Harold's brother, his blood brother. Victor Harrington grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him back down, but even the attorney's face had gone gray. Margaret reached into her file and produced a document. For the record, the original voluntary relinquishment of parental rights is on file with King County Family Court. File number 2010 GH 5847. I have a certified copy here, which any party may examine. She laid the document on the table. Sandra stared at it like it was a live grenade. The room was absolutely silent. You could hear the rain against the windows. You could hear people breathing. Sandra didn't sit back down. Her composure, that careful mask she'd worn into the room, cracked visibly. Her voice rose, sharp and desperate. This is insane. That paper doesn't mean anything. We're still her family. Margaret's voice remained level. Mrs. Myers, I must ask you to take your seat. Disrupting the reading of a will is a matter the court takes seriously. Sandra ignored her. She pointed directly at me. She did this. She manipulated Harold against his own family. She poisoned him against us. Dr. Patricia Wells from Seattle Children's Hospital looked uncomfortable. The charity representatives hadn't signed up for a family meltdown. Tiffany tugged at Sandra's sleeve. Mom, sit down. People are watching. I don't care who's watching, Sandra's voice cracked. I want to know how this happened. Harold loved Richard. They were brothers. Finally I spoke. My voice came out calm, steady, the way Uncle Harold had taught me to speak in difficult negotiations. Never raise your voice. Make them strain to hear you. Sandra, you made a choice 15 years ago. You put my belongings in garbage bags and left me on a porch in the dark. Then you went inside and signed a document giving me away. I was 13 years old. The room was absolutely silent. That was your decision, I continued. Not mine. Not Uncle Harold's. Yours. Everything that's happening today is simply the consequence of what you chose to do that night. Sandra's mouth opened, but no words came out. I looked at her steadily. I don't hate you, but I also don't owe you anything. You made sure of that when you signed that paper. Victor Harrington was writing furiously on his legal pad, though I couldn't imagine what strategy he thought he could salvage. Margaret cleared her throat. If we may continue, I haven't yet read Clause 7. Sandra finally sank back into her chair. But Clause 7 was the one that would truly end her hopes. Margaret turned to page 12 of the will and paused. Then she read the words that would change everything. Article 7. Designation of sole beneficiary. The room held its breath. I hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all real property, investment accounts, liquid assets, and personal effects, to my legally adopted daughter, Diana Marie Myers. Adopted. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sandra's face went white. Actually white, like someone had drained the blood from her head. Adopted. Richard's voice was hoarse. Since when? Margaret answered with the same calm precision she'd used throughout. Mr. Harold Myers formally adopted Diana Marie Myers on September 12th, 2012, when she was 15 years old. The adoption was finalized in King County Family Court, file number 2012, AD 3291. As Mr. and Mrs. Richard Myers had already legally relinquished their parental rights in 2010, no additional consent was required. And there it was. Uncle Harold hadn't just taken me in. He hadn't just raised me. He had legally, officially, permanently made me his daughter. While my biological parents were going about their lives, pretending I'd never existed, Uncle Harold was in court, making sure I would always belong somewhere. Making sure I would always have a family. Making sure that if they ever came back looking for money, they would find nothing but locked doors and legal documents with their own signatures on them. In Part 4, I'm going to tell you what happened next. How their lawyer walked out. How my mother made one last desperate play. How Uncle Harold left a letter that reduced me to tears in front of everyone. And how justice, real, cold, perfectly executed justice, felt when it finally arrived. Because this isn't just about money. This was never about money. This is about what happens when people who threw you away realize you were the only thing worth keeping. Stay with me. We're almost at the end. Tiffany stared at me from her chair against the wall. Her face a mixture of shock and something that might have been grief. So you're not even related to us anymore. I met her eyes directly, not legally, not since Mom and Dad signed me away. Margaret continued reading, her voice carrying Uncle Harold's words into the room like he was speaking from beyond the grave. Diana is not merely a beneficiary. She is my daughter in every way that matters. Legally, practically, and emotionally. She has worked alongside me for years, proven her competence and integrity, and I trust her completely to continue the work I began. There is no one more deserving of this inheritance, and no one I love more. My vision blurred. I blinked back tears. Uncle Harold had never told me about the full language of this clause. He'd kept it a secret, waiting for this moment, knowing it might come, knowing that when it did, I would need to hear these words in front of the people who'd tried to erase me. Sandra was shaking her head slowly, like someone trying to wake from a nightmare. "This can't be legal," she whispered. "Victor, tell them this can't be legal." Victor Harrington didn't answer. He was staring at his legal pad, pen motionless. He knew the case was over. He knew he'd walked into a legal ambush orchestrated by a dead man who'd thought of everything. Margaret reached into her folder and withdrew a sealed envelope, smaller than the others. "There's one more item," she said. "Mr. Myers left a personal letter for Diana with instructions that I offer to read a portion aloud during this proceeding, if Diana consents." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Margaret opened the envelope carefully and unfolded a single handwritten page. Uncle Harold's familiar script filled the paper. The same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and emails and notes left on my desk over 15 years. Margaret began to read. "Diana, If this letter is being read aloud, it means things happened exactly as I expected. Your biological family showed up looking for money they never earned from a man they never cared about. I'm sorry you have to go through this, but I also know you're strong enough to handle it. A soft sound escaped Sandra's throat, almost a whimper. Margaret continued, You came to me as a wounded child, thrown away by people who should have protected you. But you didn't let that define you. You transformed your pain into determination, your loneliness into independence, your rejection into resilience. I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life. Margaret's voice softened slightly as she read the next part. I didn't save you, Diana. You saved yourself. I just gave you a place to do it. Everything you've achieved, your education, your career, your character, you earned through your own effort. I'm leaving you my estate not because you need it, but because you deserve it and because I know you'll use it to help others the way I tried to help you. Tears were streaming down my face now. I didn't try to stop them. Margaret read the final lines. Don't let them make you feel guilty for surviving them. Don't let them back in unless you choose to. You owe them nothing. You owe yourself everything. I love you, Diana. Forever your father, Harold. The room was silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and my quiet crying. Even the charity representatives looked moved. Thomas Graham, the auditor, was wiping his eyes. Sandra made one last desperate play. She stood again, but this time her voice had shifted. The anger was gone, replaced by something that was meant to sound like wounded motherhood but came across as pure manipulation. Diana, sweetheart, I know things were hard when you were young. I made mistakes. I admit that now, but we're still blood. We can work through this. Can't we at least talk about dividing the estate fairly? I wiped my eyes and looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who had spent 15 years pretending I didn't exist was now calling me sweetheart. This woman who had signed legal documents erasing me from her life was now talking about blood. This woman who had thrown me away like garbage was now suggesting we divide millions of dollars fairly. You gave up the right to call me sweetheart 15 years ago, I said quietly. Sandra's face hardened immediately. The mask dropped. I want to contest this will, she announced to the room, her voice rising. Victor, tell them we have grounds. Undue influence. Harold was sick. She isolated him. Victor Harrington finally spoke, though he sounded like a man reading his own obituary. Mrs. Myers, perhaps we should discuss our options privately. No, Sandra snapped. Tell them we're going to fight this. Margaret interrupted by turning her iPad around to face the room. On the screen was an email thread. Mr. Harrington, perhaps you'd like to explain this to your clients. The room went quiet. Margaret read aloud. This is an email dated March 3rd, 2022, from Harold Myers to Victor Harrington. The subject line is terminating services. In the email, Mr. Myers writes, Victor, I am ending our professional relationship. Your advice that I include Richard in my estate plan, despite his years of financial exploitation and his treatment of Diana, is unacceptable. I will be engaging new counsel. She looked up at Victor. You previously represented Harold Myers. You were terminated because you advocated for Richard's interests over Harold's wishes. And now you've accepted this case against Harold's estate without disclosing that conflict of interest to your current clients. Victor's face had gone the color of old concrete. Sandra turned to stare at him. You told me we would win. He had no answer. Victor Harrington stood up abruptly, gathering his Mont Blanc briefcase with shaking hands. I need to review these documents, he said, his voice stripped of its earlier polish. We should discuss our options privately, Mrs. Myers. Discuss what? Sandra's voice was rising again, panic creeping in. You're leaving right now? In the middle of this? Victor didn't answer. He was already moving toward the door, walking with the stiff gait of a man who knew his career might be imploding. He'd taken a case with a massive conflict of interest, failed to disclose it, and just got exposed in front of multiple witnesses, including representatives from major charitable organizations. "Victor!" Sandra called after him. "Victor!" The conference room door closed behind him with a soft click. Sandra stood frozen, abandoned by her own attorney in front of everyone she'd hoped to impress. Richard hadn't said a word in minutes. He sat slumped in his chair, staring at the floor. He'd spent his whole life following Sandra's lead, and now she had led them both off a cliff. Tiffany was crying quietly. I couldn't tell if she was upset about the money or about the public humiliation or about finally seeing her mother for exactly what she was. Sandra turned back to me one more time. The mask was completely gone now. Underneath, it was just desperation. And beneath that, something that might have been the first stirrings of real regret, though I suspected it was more regret at getting caught than regret for what she'd done. "Diana," her voice broke. "We can still, we're still a family, aren't we? Blood is blood. You could still." I stood up from the table, gathering my folder. "Sandra, you stopped being my family on July 15th, 2010. You signed the document yourself. I didn't make that choice. You did." I looked at her steadily. "I don't hate you. I actually feel sorry for you. But you have no claim on me. Not legally, not emotionally, not in any way that matters." I turned to Margaret. "Can we continue with the remaining articles?" Margaret nodded. Sandra sat down heavily. She didn't speak again for the rest of the reading. Margaret turned to the next section with practiced calm. Article 9. Charitable Bequests. The representatives from the 3 charitable organizations straightened in their seats. "I direct that the following gifts be made from my estate. $500,000 to Seattle Children's Hospital, to be used for the establishment of a scholarship fund for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. $300,000 to Habitat for Humanity Northwest for the construction of affordable housing in the greater Seattle area. $200,000 to the Olympic National Park Foundation for wilderness preservation and environmental education programs." Dr. Patricia Wells from Seattle Children's Hospital nodded solemnly. "Harold was one of our most consistent donors for over 2 decades. This gift will help hundreds of families." The representative from Habitat for Humanity added, "We've built 6 homes with Harold's previous donations. This will fund at least 4 more." Margaret continued, "I also request that my daughter Diana continue the charitable giving programs I established during my lifetime at her discretion. I trust her judgment completely. I found my voice. I will. I'll honor everything Uncle Harold built." A thought occurred to me as I looked at the 3 charity representatives sitting in this room. They weren't here because the law required it. They were here because Uncle Harold had asked them to come. He'd wanted witnesses, neutral parties who could testify to exactly what had happened here today if Sandra and Richard tried to pursue their case further. Uncle Harold had anticipated every move. Dr. Wells caught my eye and offered a small, kind smile. "Harold used to talk about you constantly. Every board meeting, every donor event. Diana did this, Diana achieved that. He was so proud of you." I blinked back fresh tears. Even in death, Uncle Harold had surrounded me with people who believed in me. When Margaret finished reading the final articles of the will, she turned to me. "Diana, as sole beneficiary and executor, would you like to say a few words?" I hadn't planned to speak, but 47 pairs of eyes were watching me, and I realized there were things that needed to be said, not for Sandra's benefit, but for my own. I rose from my seat. "Most of you knew Uncle Harold far longer than I did. He took me in when I was 13 years old and had nothing. He gave me a home, an education, and most importantly, a family that chose to love me." I looked around the room at the Myers Property Holdings employees who had watched me grow from an intern into a CFO, at the charity representatives who had witnessed Uncle Harold's generosity for decades. With this inheritance, I intend to continue everything Harold built. The properties will be managed with the same integrity he established. The charitable commitments will be maintained. And I'll be establishing a new scholarship fund, the Myers STEM Scholarship, for children from difficult family situations who need someone to believe in them. My eyes found Sandra, still sitting rigid in her chair. As for my biological relatives, I hold no grudge. I've made peace with what happened. But peace doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean opening doors that I've worked hard to close. I took a breath. Harold taught me that family is about choice. The people who show up for you when everything falls apart, those are your family. By that definition, the people in this room who knew Harold, who worked with him, who respected him, you're more my family than the people who share my DNA. I sat back down. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Thomas Graham, the auditor, began to clap. Others followed. The sound filled the conference room. Applause for Uncle Harold, for justice, for the truth finally being spoken out loud. Sandra didn't move. Margaret, formally, concluded the reading at 3:47 p.m. The will has been read in its entirety. All legal requirements have been satisfied. Ms. Myers, you may contact our office next week to begin the transfer process. The estate should be fully settled within 14 business days. People began to rise, conversations murmuring to life around the room. Sandra stood slowly, like a woman who had aged 10 years in 2 hours. Richard was already shuffling toward the door, not looking at anyone. Tiffany gathered her purse and followed her father without a word. Sandra lingered. She turned back to look at me one final time. Her makeup had smeared slightly around her eyes. The confident woman who had entered this room expecting millions now looked diminished, smaller somehow. She opened her mouth as if to say something. I saw her lips form what might have been the beginning of, "I'm sorry," but then she closed her mouth, turned away, and walked out. I watched her go. This woman who had thrown me away like damaged goods, who had signed papers to make it legal, who had shown up 15 years later, expecting to profit from her cruelty. I felt a brief flicker of something. Not satisfaction exactly, not vindication, but something more complicated. The strange emptiness that comes when a chapter finally closes. Dr. Wells from Seattle Children's Hospital approached me as the room cleared. "Harold talked about you every time we met," she said, shaking my hand. "He told me once that taking you in was the best decision he ever made. I can see why." She pressed a business card into my palm. "When you're ready to discuss that scholarship fund, please call me directly." Elena appeared at my side, squeezing my arm. "You did it," she said quietly. "Harold would be so proud." I looked at the photo of Uncle Harold I'd brought with me. I hoped she was right. Now, I need to tell you what happened after that conference room emptied, because the story doesn't end there. 1 week after the will reading, Margaret Morrison filed a formal complaint with the Washington State Bar Association. The subject: Victor Harrington's ethical violations. I didn't ask her to do it. She did it because it was her professional obligation. When an attorney witnesses another attorney violating the rules of professional conduct, reporting isn't optional. It's required. The complaint outlined 3 violations. First, conflict of interest. Harrington had previously represented Harold Myers and gained confidential information about his estate planning. Second, failure to disclose. Harrington never told Sandra or Richard about his prior relationship with Harold. Third, misrepresentation. Harrington had led his clients to believe they had a strong case when he knew or should have known that their legal position was fundamentally compromised. 2 months later, in late May 2025, the Bar Association issued its ruling. Victor Harrington was suspended from practicing law for 6 months. He was also fined $15,000 and required to complete additional ethics training. Within weeks of the suspension, 3 of Harrington's largest clients quietly transferred their business elsewhere. I heard through legal community gossip that his firm's revenue dropped by roughly $200,000 that year. Elena asked me once if I felt satisfied by Harrington's downfall. I didn't do anything to him, I told her. He did this to himself. I just happened to be there when the consequences caught up. That was the truth. I hadn't sought revenge against Victor Harrington. I hadn't filed the complaint. I hadn't lobbied for his suspension. He had made his own choices, taking a case he knew was ethically compromised, lying to clients who trusted him, betting he could win through intimidation rather than merit. His career suffered because of what he chose to do. Some people build their own prisons without any help. 3 weeks after the will reading, an email appeared in my inbox from sandermeyers1969@gmail.com. Subject, please read. I almost deleted it without opening it, but curiosity won. The message was longer than I expected. Sandra had never been one for written communication. She preferred phone calls where she could control the tone, interrupt, redirect. The email hit all the predictable notes. She'd been thinking about what happened. She was angry and said things she shouldn't have. She understood now that she made mistakes when I was young. She was overwhelmed. Richard and I were struggling financially. Things got away from us. Then came the real pitch. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for a chance to make things right. We're still family, Diana. Blood doesn't just disappear because of legal papers. I'm your mother. Nothing can change that. Can we talk? I think if we just sat down together, we could work through this. I love you. I always have. Mom. I read the email 3 times. Then I called Dr. Hayes, my therapist, and read it to her over the phone. What do you notice about the email? She asked. I thought about it. She acknowledges mistakes, but doesn't name what they were. She blames circumstances, financial struggles, being overwhelmed. She says she's not asking for money, but then pivots to working through this. And she still calls herself Mom, even though she signed away that right. What do you want to do? I took 2 days to write my response. It was 4 sentences long. Sandra, I've read your email. I forgave you a long time ago for myself, not for you. But I don't want a relationship with you. Please don't contact me again. She didn't reply. I felt no guilt, only clarity. Here's what I want you to understand. This story isn't about revenge. It's about something far more important. It's about what happens when you refuse to let the people who tried to break you define your worth. It's about choosing yourself when nobody else will. It's about understanding that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart. My parents made a choice 15 years ago. They chose money over me. They chose favoritism over fairness. They chose to erase me rather than deal with the inconvenience of treating both their children equally. And Uncle Harold made a choice too. He chose to drive 3 hours through the night to pick up a scared kid sitting on a porch in the dark. He chose to invest in me when I had nothing to offer in return. He chose to legally adopt me, to make me his daughter, to build a future for me that my biological parents couldn't imagine. So here's my question for you, and I want you to really think about this. Do you believe blood makes you family? Or do you believe family is the people who choose you, who show up for you, who invest in your future even when there's nothing in it for them? Drop a comment and let me know, because I guarantee some of you are going to say, blood matters most. Some of you are going to defend my parents. Some of you are going to say, I should have taken the settlement, divided the estate, forgiven, and moved on. And to those people, I want to ask, at what point does unconditional forgiveness become enabling? At what point does family loyalty become a shield for people who've done terrible things? At what point do you get to stop setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm? If this story made you feel something, anger at my parents, validation for your own experiences, hope that justice actually exists, then I need you to do something for me. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's been made to feel small by their own family. Someone who's been told they're selfish for setting boundaries. Someone who needs permission to choose themselves. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about people who refuse to stay small, who built themselves back up after being torn down, who learned that sometimes the family you choose is the only family that matters, then you need to watch this next video right here. It's about a woman whose parents wrote her out of their will because she refused to give them money, only to discover she'd already inherited everything from the grandmother who actually loved her. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when they find out. Until next time, remember this. You don't need anyone's permission to know your worth. You don't need anyone's approval to choose yourself. And you definitely don't need to keep doors open for people who proved they'll only walk through them to hurt you. Your story is yours to write. Make sure you're holding the pen.